Those words hit me like a slap across the face. "You're embarrassing the family, Mother." Said in front of 47 relatives. Said in front of my grandchildren. Said in front of neighbors who had known me for 40 years, who had come to my husband's funeral and brought food to my porch in the weeks after and called to check on me every single month since. Said by the boy I had carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood fevers, sat beside through every hard year of his growing up, and worked my fingers raw and my body thin to put through law school. But what happened next, what I pulled from my cardigan pocket and read aloud to every single person at that reunion, left my son speechless, his wife in tears, and my entire family in a state of absolute, jaw-dropping, irreversible shock. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please stay with me until the very end of this story, because every single part of it matters. Every detail has a reason. And when you're done, please leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I want to know how many people out there have felt what I felt and needed to hear that it doesn't have to stay that way. My name is Dorothy Jean Hargrove. Most people who love me call me Dot. I am 72 years old. I have lived in Cedarfield, Tennessee my entire life, in the same county where my parents were born, where I met my husband, where I raised my children, where I buried my husband, and where I intend to end my days when the time comes, on my own terms, in my own home, on my own land. I am not a dramatic woman. I have never been someone who seeks attention or enjoys conflict or makes scenes in front of other people. I have spent the better part of 7 decades being quiet, being useful, being present for the people I love without asking for very much in return. That quality was instilled in me before I was old enough to choose it, and for most of my life I believed it was a virtue. I am no longer entirely sure about that. There is a limit to how much a person can quietly absorb. There is a point at which patience becomes passivity and silence becomes surrender. And on that hot July afternoon at the Pinecrest Farm family reunion, surrounded by the people I had spent my whole life loving and feeding and showing up for, I reached that point. This is my story. All of it. From the very beginning, so you understand exactly how we arrived at that moment and why what I did was not anger. It was not drama. It was not the act of a bitter old woman seeking revenge. It was the act of a woman who finally, after a lifetime of letting things go, decided to hold on. I was born in 1952 in a 2-room house on the eastern edge of Cedarfield, Tennessee, where the town stopped and the hills began. My father, Harold Pickett, worked 6 days a week at the Cedarfield lumber mill, up at 4:30 every morning, home by 6 in the evening smelling of sawdust and machine oil, eating his supper quietly, asking each of us about our day, falling asleep in his chair before 9. My mother, June Pickett, took in ironing and mending from the better-off families in town to bring in extra money. She pressed other women's Sunday dresses on a board set up in our narrow kitchen, and she did it without complaint and without resentment, and that, the working without complaint and without resentment, was the most important lesson she ever taught me. We were poor in the way that poor people in small southern towns were poor in those days. Quietly. Without drama. Without any expectation that the situation entitled you to something different, because everyone around you was the same way and there was no use making noise about something you could not change. You worked with what you had. You were grateful for what you had. And you did not measure yourself against what other people had, because that road led nowhere good. I was the second of 4 children. My older sister Norma, my younger brother Carl, and my baby sister May. We shared beds and hand-me-down clothes and a single bathroom with a door that never quite latched properly because the frame had swollen in the summer heat and no one had ever gotten around to fixing it. We ate simple food. We wore simple clothes. We went to the same public school where our parents had gone before us. But we were loved. Fiercely, consistently, demonstrably loved. My father never came home without saying good evening to each of us by name. My mother never put us to bed without telling us she was proud of us. That love was not performed for an audience. It was simply there, the way the air was there, something you existed inside of without particularly thinking about it until the day you understood that not everyone had it. Those early lessons, work without complaint, love through action, measure yourself by your own standards, shaped everything about who I became. They shaped the ways I was strong and, I came to understand later, the ways I was sometimes too willing to accept what I should have refused. I met Ernest Hargrove when I was 19 years old at a church potluck supper on the first Sunday of October, 1971. He was 22, the son of a tobacco farmer from the next county, a tall quiet man with large capable hands and a slow easy smile and the most honest eyes I had ever seen on a human being. Clear and steady and direct. The eyes of a person who had nothing to hide because he had never bothered to develop the habit of hiding things. He did not say much that first evening. He ate his food and listened to the conversations around him and carried his own plate to the kitchen without being asked, which impressed my mother more than anything else he could have done. And when the evening was ending and I was gathering my dish to carry to the car, he appeared beside me and picked it up before I could and said, "Allow me." Carried it to my car for me. Set it in the back seat carefully. And then stood there in the church parking lot in the October chill and asked, with a formality that was entirely genuine, whether he might write to me. Not call. Write. Because he had a deliberateness about him, even at 22, that understood the difference between things done quickly and things done right. We exchanged letters for 4 months. Real letters, written by hand on lined paper, folded into envelopes, sent through the United States mail. I still have every one of them in a shoebox in my closet. Ernest wrote the way he did everything, carefully, without unnecessary words, saying exactly what he meant and nothing extra. His letters were not romantic in any theatrical way. They were honest. They told me who he was and what he thought and what he hoped for. By the time we began seeing each other on Sunday afternoons, I already knew him in a way that most people do not know each other after years. One evening in February 1972, sitting together on the front porch swing of my parents' house with the cold air moving up from the valley below Cedarfield and our breath showing in small white clouds, Ernest reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. A simple gold band. A small chip of diamond that caught the porch light and threw a tiny rainbow across the palm of his hand. "Dorothy Jean Pickett," he said, in that slow and careful way of his, as though each word deserved its full weight. "I would be honored if you would agree to be my wife." I said yes before he finished the sentence. I would have said it before he started the sentence if I had known it was coming. We married in April 1972. Cedarfield First Baptist Church, a ceremony that lasted 45 minutes and a reception in the fellowship hall afterward where my mother made the cake and Ernest's father made a toast that was 3 sentences long and entirely sincere. Ernest's father had given him a piece of land, 22 acres at the end of a gravel road 4 miles outside of town, winding back through cedar and hickory and poplar, ending at a rise that looked north over a long valley with a ridge of pine trees along its upper edge. That ridge gave the property its name. Pinecrest Farm. The place that would hold the next 50 years of our lives. The early years were hard in the way that early years of a life built from scratch are always hard, not catastrophically hard, not the grinding destitute hardness of real poverty, but the constant low-level strain of never having quite enough and always needing to be careful. Ernest worked at his father's tobacco farm during the week and spent every evening and every weekend building our house with his own hands. His father helped. His 2 brothers, Gerald and Dale, came on Saturdays. Neighbors who had known the Hargrove family for generations showed up with tools and time and the kind of unrewarded generosity that used to be common in small communities. I worked as a bookkeeper at Cedarfield Hardware during those years, keeping their accounts and their payroll and their inventory records for a salary that was modest but consistent. Every dollar I earned beyond what we needed for groceries and utilities went into a savings account. We did not eat at restaurants. We did not take vacations. We did not buy anything that was not necessary. And slowly, piece by piece, Pinecrest took shape. The house took 2 years to complete properly. 3 bedrooms. A kitchen that faced the back field so you could watch the weather coming across the valley while you cooked. A living room with a stone fireplace that Ernest built himself, laying each stone by hand. And the porch, the long covered porch that ran the entire front length of the house, built from cedar planks that Ernest milled himself from trees he cleared on the north ridge. Every plank measured to within a fraction of an inch. Every joint fitted so tight that 20 years later, 30 years later, you still could not see daylight between them. When I tell people that Ernest built our house with his own hands, they nod politely and imagine something rough-hewn and makeshift. That was not what Ernest built. What Ernest built was precise and solid and made to last because Ernest did not know how to make things any other way. Our son Marcus was born in 1976. Our daughter Renee came 2 years later in 1978. Those years when the children were small are the ones I return to most often in my memory, not because they were easy, they were not always easy, but because they were full. Full of purpose. Full of the satisfaction of a life being built in exactly the right direction. The farm grew slowly over those years. Ernest purchased additional acreage when neighboring parcels came available, always carefully, always within what we could manage. He started running cattle on the back fields and growing hay on the lower acres. I kept the farm's books alongside my continuing work for several businesses in town. We were not wealthy by any conventional measure. But we were building something real, and we both knew it, and the knowing was its own form of contentment. Marcus was a sharp-minded child. Quick to understand, quick to speak, quick to form an opinion and defend it with a fluency that surprised adults who met him for the first time. His teachers spoke of his potential in ways that made Ernest and me alternately proud and privately cautious. Pride because our son was clearly gifted. Caution because Ernest had watched gifted people use their gifts unwisely often enough to know that intelligence without humility was a dangerous combination. Son's got ambition, Ernest said to me one evening on the porch when Marcus was about 14, his voice carrying the slow deliberate quality it always had when he was saying something he had thought about carefully. That's a good thing. But ambition without patience is just greed wearing a respectable suit. I told him he was being too hard on a boy who was still finding himself. Ernest looked at the fields for a long moment. Maybe, he said. I hope so. Renee was quieter, steadier, more like her father in temperament. She loved Pinecrest with a physical and uncomplicated affection that Marcus never shared. While her brother talked about getting out of Cedarfield and becoming someone important somewhere else, Renee spent her summers helping Ernest in the fields and her evenings reading at the kitchen table, entirely content with exactly where she was. She was not less ambitious than her brother. She was simply not ashamed of her starting point. When Marcus was accepted to the University of Tennessee with a partial scholarship, Ernest and I cried together in the kitchen after the children were in bed. It was the first time I had seen Ernest cry since his own father's funeral. Our son was going to college. He was the first person in either of our families to do so. That felt like the fulfillment of something we had been working toward for years without quite naming it. We helped in every way we could. We took out a second mortgage on Pinecrest to cover what the scholarship didn't reach. I picked up additional bookkeeping clients and worked evenings to manage the extra load. In one difficult year when money was particularly tight, Ernest sold 20 acres of the back pasture, land he had spent years saving to purchase, to a neighboring farmer so that Marcus could stay in school without worrying about tuition. We never told Marcus about the 20 acres. He was focused on his studies and his future, and we did not want the weight of our sacrifice settling on his shoulders. That was our choice to make. We made it gladly. After college came 3 years of law school at the University of Tennessee. More sacrifice. More careful management. More evenings when I sat at the kitchen table going over accounts and moving money from one column to another and finding ways to make the numbers work. Ernest never complained. I never complained. We were building something for our son, and that was its own reward. Marcus graduated from law school in 2001 and took a position at a Nashville firm specializing in corporate real estate transactions. He was talented and he worked extremely hard and he rose quickly. Within 5 years he was being talked about as a future partner. Within 10 he was one of the most sought-after real estate attorneys in Middle Tennessee, known specifically for his ability to structure complicated property deals and large land acquisitions for major development interests. The calls home became shorter and less frequent as the years passed. I understood. He was building something. Building takes time and focus, and you cannot always stop to look back while you are doing it. I did not take the silence personally, at least not initially. Then in the autumn of 2008, Marcus brought home Claudette Beaumont. Claudette came from Brentwood, the wealthy suburb that sits south of Nashville where old Tennessee family money and newer developer money exist side by side in large houses behind iron gates and well-maintained landscaping. Her father, Preston Beaumont, had built his fortune in commercial real estate development over 30 years, which was how he and Marcus had first crossed paths professionally. Her mother, Vivian, came from a family that had been wealthy for long enough that the wealth had become invisible to them, simply the natural condition of things, unremarkable, assumed. Claudette had been educated at private schools from kindergarten through university. She had summered in places that working people visited on television. She had never, as far as I could determine, worked at a job that required genuine daily effort, though she had eventually settled on calling herself an interior design consultant, which seemed to involve meeting wealthy clients for lunch and selecting paint colors for rooms she would never clean. She was beautiful. I will acknowledge that honestly. Tall, carefully put together, with the kind of confident poise that comes from decades of being told you are worth looking at. She shook my hand the first time we met with a smile that was practiced to the point of perfection, warm enough in appearance to pass any social inspection, empty enough underneath that I felt its absence like a faint chill. "Darling," Marcus had said during that first visit, his arm around Claudette's waist, looking at our home with an expression that I could not entirely read but that contained something I had never seen in his face before, a kind of apologetic self-consciousness that hurt more than I showed. "This is Pinecrest Farm. This is where I grew up." Claudette's eyes moved across our living room, Ernest's furniture, my curtains, the family photographs in mismatched frames, the braided rug that had been on our floor for 30 years, in the practiced way of a person doing a rapid and thorough appraisal. Her nose did not wrinkle. She was too polished for that. But something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly into the settled satisfaction of a person whose assumptions have been confirmed. "How quaint," she said. Precisely the way a person says a word when they mean its opposite. Ernest caught my eye across the kitchen and shook his head once, very slightly. "Don't," his eyes said. "Not tonight." I let it go. During dinner Claudette ate carefully and said little about the food and spent the larger portion of the meal relating stories about her own family's life, the Smoky Mountain vacation house, her mother's charity gala commitments, her father's development projects, a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast that she described in considerable detail for people who had never been there and were unlikely to go. Every story was chosen with a precision that I do not think was entirely conscious. Every story widened the distance between her world and ours, reminded the table of exactly where she came from and what she was accustomed to. After they left, Ernest and I sat together on the porch in the dark for a long time. "That's going to be trouble," Ernest said. I told him he was being unfair. She was nervous. Meeting her boyfriend's family for the first time. Give her time and charity. Ernest was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark fields. "Some people's problems aren't about nervousness, Dorothy," he finally said. "They're about who they are at the center." I married the wisest man I have ever known. I did not always listen to him as carefully as I should have. They married in 2010. The ceremony was at the Beaumont family's country club in Brentwood. It was a beautiful event in the way that very expensive events are always beautiful, flawlessly organized, impeccably catered, attended by people whose clothes and jewelry represented more money than I had earned in the previous decade. I wore a lavender dress from Dillard's that I had bought on clearance and I spent most of the evening trying to be invisible, which is not a skill you should need at your own son's wedding. Claudette's mother, Vivian, spoke to me exactly twice. Once to ask in a bright social tone what I did, and once to tell me, with a smile designed to appear generous, that Marcus had turned out so wonderfully in spite of his background. In spite of. The two words she chose to connect my son's success to his origins. As though Pinecrest and the people who built it were an obstacle he had overcome rather than a foundation he had been given. I excused myself to the restroom and stood in a marble stall for 3 minutes and breathed. In spite of. After the wedding, Marcus and Claudette settled into a large house in a prestigious Nashville suburb. Beautiful house. The kind of house that appears in architectural publications and requires a full-time staff to maintain properly. I visited twice in the first year and both times left feeling like a distant relative who had arrived uninvited, welcomed with the minimum courtesy required by good manners, offered nothing genuine. The first visit was for Thanksgiving. I had offered to cook, because cooking for my family is one of the ways I know how to love them, and that offer was accepted, not graciously, not with appreciation, but in the manner of someone accepting a service that will save them a mild inconvenience. I spent 2 days in their kitchen, in an apron that did not belong to me, using appliances that cost more than my car, cooking food that I had cooked every Thanksgiving of my adult life. Claudette sat at her kitchen island with a glass of white wine and made suggestions that were not suggestions so much as corrections delivered with a smile. Actually, we don't do the stuffing inside the bird. The caterer who does our Christmas dinner told me it's really not safe. And, actually, we use sea salt. The regular stuff is in the back of the pantry somewhere if you prefer. And, most memorably, actually, we've been doing a more modern Thanksgiving, fewer traditional sides, more interesting flavors. I have a cookbook I could show you. I smiled through every one of these corrections. I made the food the way I had always made it. Ernest, who had come with me, sat at the kitchen island across from Claudette and said almost nothing the entire 2 days and met my eyes occasionally with an expression of quiet, tired recognition. The food was good. Everyone ate plenty of it. No one said so to me directly. The second visit was in the spring. I had driven to Nashville specifically to see the grandchildren, who were small enough then that the drive was entirely worthwhile for an afternoon in their company. Claudette received me at the door with an expression of mild surprise, as though she had forgotten I was coming despite the phone call we had had 2 days before confirming the arrangement. She showed me into the living room, offered me coffee, and then spent the next 20 minutes on a phone call in the next room. The children were brought to me eventually by their nanny, a young woman who treated me with more genuine warmth than their mother had managed, and I spent 2 hours on the floor of the living room playing with Lily and holding baby Theo and being as happy as I had been in months. When it was time to leave, Claudette materialized from wherever she had been and walked me to the door and said she was so glad I had come all this way, in a tone that made all this way mean exactly what it appeared to mean. I drove the 4 hours home and called Ernest from a rest stop and told him everything, and he listened without interrupting, and when I was done he said, I know. I know. Which was the only response that could have helped. I want to be fair to Claudette, because fairness is one of the values my parents instilled in me that I have tried to maintain throughout my life even when it is inconvenient. Claudette was not a monster. She was not evil in any calculated way. She was a woman who had been raised to believe that certain things mattered: appearances, addresses, social position, the performance of a particular kind of success, and who had married my son in part because he fit a certain image of ambition and upward mobility that she was pursuing as deliberately as someone might pursue a career or a qualification. She was not cruel to me the way that cruel people are cruel. She was indifferent to me in the particular way of someone who has simply decided that you do not count. That your presence or absence, your comfort or discomfort, your feelings or their absence, none of it registers as something worth attending to. And yet, I have to be honest about this too. That indifference was its own daily injury. Every gathering at their house where I was received but not welcomed. Every holiday where I cooked and contributed and was thanked in the manner of someone thanking a catering service. Every visit to Pinecrest where she moved through the rooms of my home with that appraising eye, that calculating quiet, as though she were already measuring it for something other than what it was. It accumulated. The way water wears stone, not through any single drop but through the continuous patient pressure of all of them together, year after year, until what looked solid from a distance had been hollowed out at the center. There is a cruelty in that kind of indifference that is harder to name and harder to address than ordinary cruelty. You cannot point to a specific act. You can only say, I am invisible to this person. I do not exist in any meaningful way in her estimation. And when you are the mother of her husband, the grandmother of her children, the woman who worked herself thin to give her husband the opportunities that made him attractive to her in the first place, the invisibility has a particular weight to it. The grandchildren arrived, and with them came the clearest and most uncomplicated joy of my later years. Lily came in 2012, quick and bright and fierce from her very first weeks, with an energy that filled whatever room she was in and a gaze that assessed you thoroughly before she decided whether you were worth her time. She had her father's intelligence and, when she was young enough that no one had taught her to suppress it, her grandfather's direct honesty. Theo arrived in 2015, a quieter child, thoughtful from the very beginning, gentle with animals and with people, content to sit and observe where other children demanded and performed. I drove to Nashville to see them whenever I could. 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes more. Those visits were not entirely comfortable. Claudette received me with the efficiency of someone checking a box, and the large beautiful house always made me feel like a piece of mismatched furniture, but the children themselves were worth every awkward hour. Lily would sit beside me on the expensive sofa and show me things from school with a seriousness that I found touching. Theo would climb into my lap before he was really too big for it and stay there until one of his parents called him to do something else. When they visited Pinecrest, which was not as often as I would have liked, those children were free in a way they were not free elsewhere. They ran across the fields and helped collect eggs and sat on the porch in the summer evenings eating the peach ice cream that Ernest made from the tree behind the barn, and they were completely and unself-consciously happy in a way that had nothing to do with addresses or appearances or the social calculations that governed their daily lives in Brentwood. "This is the best place in the whole world, Grandma," Theo told me once when he was 5, sitting on the porch steps with ice cream running down his chin. Ernest heard him from the doorway and caught my eye and smiled. "Yes it is, baby," I told him. "Yes it is." Ernest died in the spring of 2020. His heart, which had been giving warning signs for 2 years, simply stopped. He went in the hospital at Cedarfield General on a Tuesday morning in April, while the dogwood trees outside his window were in their fullest bloom. He went quietly, the way he had lived, without fuss, without performance, with a dignity that was entirely and specifically his own. I was holding his hand. I did not let go for a long time after. The grief was the largest thing I had ever experienced. 48 years. More than 2/3 of my entire life. Ernest had been so woven into the fabric of my daily existence that for months after his death I would turn to say something to him before I remembered, and the remembering was like losing him over and over, 100 small losses accumulating into one enormous ongoing absence. But Ernest had prepared me. Not for the grief, nothing prepares you for that, but for everything practical. In the final months before his death, knowing what was coming, he had spent long quiet evenings with Arthur Pembroke at the kitchen table, going through accounts and documents and the patient legal architecture of everything he had built over 50 years. What those evenings revealed was more than I had fully understood while it was happening. Ernest had been building quietly for decades. The farm had grown from 22 original acres to 114 through careful, unhurried acquisition of neighboring parcels as they became available, never overreaching, never buying what he couldn't manage, always thinking 10 years ahead rather than 10 months. As residential development expanded northward from Nashville along the I-65 corridor, that land had appreciated in ways that transformed it from a working farm into one of the most valuable undeveloped parcels in that stretch of Middle Tennessee. Beyond the land, Ernest had made an investment in the mid-1990s that he had never discussed with anyone except Arthur. A small precision machining company in Gallatin called Hargrove Parts LLC, which produced components for the regional automotive supply chain, had been struggling when its founder approached Ernest looking for a partner. Ernest had bought a minority stake for very little money. He had watched the business carefully for years. He had increased his stake steadily as opportunities arose. By the time he died, he held a 62% majority interest in a company that had grown from a struggling small operation into a profitable and established manufacturer. Ernest had never talked about any of this. He did not believe in counting chickens. He did not believe in discussing what you had before you knew what it was truly worth. And he did not believe, I understood this clearly when Arthur finally laid out the full picture, that Marcus should know the details before Ernest was certain they would be handled correctly. He structured everything into a trust. The Hargrove Family Trust, established on February 14, 2020, 6 weeks before he died. Arthur Pembroke drew the documents and witnessed the signatures. And Ernest named me, Dorothy Jean Hargrove, his wife of 48 years, as sole trustee. Not Marcus. Not both of us jointly. Not the children together. Me, alone, with full authority over every asset for the duration of my natural life. Dorothy, Ernest said to me the night he explained what he had done, his voice thinner than it used to be but his eyes exactly as steady as they had always been. I thought about this carefully for a long time. Marcus is smart. He's a good lawyer. But he has spent the last 10 years becoming someone who measures everything by what it's worth in money. I love him and I don't say that to condemn him. But I don't trust his judgment with this. Ernest. He held up one hand gently. You're the one who kept this going. You're the one who understood what we were building and why it mattered beyond money. You're the one who gave up things and never complained about giving them up. This land is yours, Dorothy. Everything we built together is yours. I want you to be the one who protects it. The trust was specific and airtight in every provision. I had full control during my lifetime. After my death, everything would pass equally to Marcus and Renee, with binding conditions protecting Pinecrest from any sale or subdivision outside the family for 20 years. The grandchildren, Lily and Theo, had educational trusts set aside in their names, protected from their parents. Ernest died 6 weeks after we signed the documents. I did not tell Marcus about the trust immediately. The weeks after Ernest's death were consumed by grief and by all the practical business that death generates, funeral arrangements, legal notifications, the overwhelming paperwork of a life ending. It was not the right time. And then as the months passed and I watched Marcus's behavior beginning to shift in ways that put a cold knot in my stomach, I found reasons to keep the information private. Part of me, the part that had been paying attention, the part that Ernest had tried to warn me about, understood that the moment Marcus learned the full extent of the trust's protections, he would begin looking for ways around them. And I was not ready for that fight while I was still learning how to be in the world without Ernest beside me. So I kept quiet. I watched. And slowly, over 2 years, the picture that formed was one that would have broken Ernest's heart down to its foundations. After Ernest's death, Marcus began treating Pinecrest as though it were already his. It started with small things that were easy to excuse individually if you were inclined to extend every possible charity. He arrived one Saturday with a man from Nashville whose name I was not given, and the two of them walked the property for over an hour speaking in the low-focused tones of people conducting business assessments. When I asked Marcus about it, he said easily that he was getting an updated sense of the property's value for estate planning purposes. Estate planning. As though my death were an administrative task in need of scheduling. He began offering opinions about farm operations with the confidence of someone who had already decided he was in charge. The cattle should be sold, too much maintenance cost for the return they generated. The hay fields weren't efficient enough per acre. He had contacts in agricultural land management who worked with families like ours, and he thought a professional consultation would be valuable. He delivered all of this with the patient tone of a successful son explaining the modern world to a mother who was good-hearted but limited in her understanding of how things actually worked. Every suggestion was a quiet assertion of authority he did not have. And because I had spent a lifetime responding to the people I loved by accommodating rather than confronting, I listened to every suggestion and thanked him for his concern and changed nothing, and the gap between what he assumed and what was true quietly widened with each visit. There were also moments that were harder to categorize as purely practical. Twice in the first year after Ernest's death, Marcus arrived at Pinecrest without calling first, with people I did not know, people who walked through my house and looked at the rooms and the layout and the proportions in a way that had nothing to do with family. Once it was two men in good clothes who spoke about sightlines and square footage. Once it was a woman who took measurements of the kitchen. I asked Marcus on both occasions what was happening and received comfortable explanations that didn't quite answer the question, and I let it go because I did not yet have what I needed to not let it go. Claudette had shifted as well, but in a different and more unsettling direction. Where previously she had dismissed Pinecrest with barely concealed contempt, she now surveyed it with the sharp attentiveness of a person calculating. I caught her photographing sections of the property on her phone during visits, walking the fence lines, looking at the barn and the outbuildings with an evaluating eye. At Christmas dinner 2 months after the funeral, she mentioned casually that she had an architect friend who had transformed similar rural Tennessee properties into extraordinary showpieces and that Pinecrest had truly remarkable bones. Remarkable bones. About the house Ernest had built with his own hands over 2 years of evenings. I said nothing. Ernest's voice in my head, let it go. But the list was growing. The list of things I was letting go was growing longer every month. And I was beginning to understand that letting things go was not the same as things being resolved. Some things you let go simply accumulate somewhere out of sight, building into something larger than any individual item would have been alone. And something else was building that I did not yet know about. In the months before the reunion, 3 things happened in quick succession that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. The first was a phone call from Arthur Pembroke on a Thursday afternoon in late June, 3 weeks before the reunion. "Dorothy," he said, and the careful control in his voice told me before he said another word that what he was calling about was serious. "I need to ask you something directly. Have you authorized anyone to negotiate on behalf of the Hargrove Family Trust?" "No," I said. "Absolutely not. What's happened?" "I've received an inquiry from a Nashville land acquisition company. Sycamore Ridge Development Group. They're asking questions about the legal structure of the Pinecrest property and the trust that holds it. They believe negotiations for a sale are already well underway." The room seemed to shift slightly. "What kind of negotiations?" "That's what I'm still establishing." "But Dorothy," they referenced Marcus by name. They told my contact they'd been working with him on this matter for several months. I sat very still at the kitchen table. Through the window I could see the back field in the late afternoon light, the cattle standing in the grass, the long ridge of pines against the sky. "Arthur," I said slowly. "Tell me what the land is actually worth. Right now. In today's market." He took a measured breath. "With the development pressure in that corridor? Conservative estimate is $3 to $3.5 million. Motivated buyer, the right negotiation, could be higher. $3 to $3.5 million. For land that had started as 22 acres and a gravel road. Look into everything," I told him. "Don't contact Marcus yet. I need the full picture first." What Arthur uncovered over the next 10 days was worse than anything I had imagined, and I had already begun imagining some very dark things during the sleepless nights between his call and his report. Marcus had been representing himself to Sycamore Ridge as the primary authority over Pinecrest. He had either not disclosed the trust or had so fundamentally misrepresented its structure that their acquisition team believed his control was essentially complete. He had met with their representatives at least 3 times over several months, formal meetings with printed materials, site visits to the property, and at least one dinner at an expensive Nashville restaurant where the deal was discussed with the ease of people who believe the central question has already been answered. He had verbally committed to a sale price of $3.2 million and had discussed a projected closing timeline. The bank that had issued the line of credit had done their own due diligence on the property, or believed they had, and had recorded the collateral in their loan documents as a Hargrove family property without verifying the trust structure that governed it. Either Marcus had actively misrepresented the ownership situation or the bank's review had been insufficiently thorough. Probably both. The result was the same, a $400,000 obligation secured against land that was not Marcus's to encumber. The money had gone toward a lifestyle that Marcus and Claudette's combined income, substantial as it was, could not sustain month to month. The large house in the prestigious neighborhood. The cars. The private school fees. The vacations that appeared on social media with the casual regularity of people who consider such things ordinary, the resort in the Cayman Islands, the wine country trips, the ski holiday. The constant entertaining that Claudette conducted as a form of social maintenance, because in the circles she inhabited the way you lived in your home and what you served and who you invited was a form of ongoing audition for a status that was never quite permanently secured. Arthur said to me carefully that the total expenditure above their documented income over the past 3 years appeared to exceed the amount of the fraudulent credit line. Which meant this had been building for longer than the bank loan. Which meant there might be other obligations I didn't yet know about. And then the last detail. The one that I had to sit with for a full day before I could think about it clearly. In his written correspondence with Sycamore Ridge, Marcus had described his mother as elderly and in declining health and had projected that he expected to have full authority over the trust within the next 1 to 2 years. He had offered this information not as a caveat but as a reassurance, a reason the acquisition timeline was realistic, a reason they could plan around it. He had used my anticipated death as a scheduling parameter. I sat with all of this for 3 days. I cooked for 47 people. I prepared the food and set up the tables and strung the lights. Ernest had always strung himself from the old hickory tree on the west side of the yard. I arranged flowers cut from the garden. I did all of it methodically and quietly while something inside me completed a long slow process that had probably been building since the first time Marcus walked Claudette through my house and I watched her eyes move across my life with the practiced efficiency of an appraiser determining value. Something was finished. Some last thread of willingness to absorb and adapt and make room and let things go had reached its end. What replaced it was not anger exactly. It was something cleaner and quieter and more resolute than anger. It was the feeling of a person who has finally located the line and is standing on it with both feet. On the Thursday before the reunion I called Arthur. I need the full trust documentation ready by Friday afternoon, I told him. Every page. Notarized. I'm going to read it at the reunion. A long pause. Dorothy. Are you certain? I thought about 20 acres sold so Marcus could stay in law school. I thought about Ernest at that kitchen table in his last weeks, carefully constructing protection for everything he had built because he already understood what I had been too hopeful to accept. I thought about the development company in Nashville being told my death was a reasonable planning horizon. I am completely certain, I said. Have it ready by 4 o'clock. The Saturday of the reunion arrived the way July mornings in Tennessee arrive, with a brightness that feels almost personal. The sky a deep uncomplicated blue, the air still cool and clean before the day's heat settled down over the land. I was up at 5:30 making scratch biscuits and the peach cobbler that had been expected at every Hargrove family reunion for 30 years, using the same recipe Ernest's mother had written in her own handwriting in a composition notebook that still lived in my kitchen drawer, using the same cast iron pan that had been in the Hargrove family for 3 generations. I stood in my kitchen in the early morning quiet and I baked and I thought and I breathed the particular smell of a summer morning on a Tennessee farm, cut grass and warm earth and the faint sweetness from the peach tree behind the barn, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to calm. The kind of calm that comes not from the absence of difficulty but from having made a decision about how to face it. Family began arriving at 11. Ernest's older brother Raymond and his wife Gloria from Knoxville, in their old reliable Buick that Raymond refused to part with. Ernest's younger brother Dale coming up from Memphis with his 3 grown children and a new grandchild I had not yet met. Cousins I saw once a year at these gatherings. Old friends who had known Ernest before I did. Neighbors who had been part of the fabric of our lives for decades. The kind of people who knew exactly who you were because they had been present while you were becoming it. Renee arrived at 11:30 with her husband Paul and their teenagers, the 4-hour drive from Chattanooga behind them. Renee was the first person I had called after speaking with Arthur, the previous Tuesday evening. I had told her everything, laid it all out clearly, and she had listened in complete and focused silence. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mama," she said. What are you going to do? I told her. Good, she said. The word direct and clean, like everything about my daughter. Just, good. Marcus and Claudette arrived at noon in Claudette's black Mercedes, which she parked in the gravel drive with the unconscious entitlement of someone who expects the world to organize itself around their vehicle. Lily came out of the back seat looking beautiful and faintly uncomfortable, in that particular way of teenagers who have not yet decided whether they belong somewhere. Theo came out of the other side, looked at Pinecrest spread before him, the fields, the oaks, the old barn, the cousins already visible in the back field, and ran. He just ran toward it, arms out, the way he had always run toward this place since he was old enough to run. That boy. Every time. Marcus wore pressed chinos and a linen shirt that probably cost more than my electric bill for 2 months. He looked successful and handsome, and something else that I had been watching accumulate in him for years without being able to name it precisely, a kind of brittleness underneath the polish, the way a surface can look solid until you press on it and feel that it is hollow. He hugged me at the door in the brief efficient way he had developed, arm around my shoulders, cheek to temple, barely 2 seconds. Hey, Mom. Place looks good. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm glad you're here. Claudette offered her cheek and I kissed it warmly because that was what the moment required. The property really is something, she said, which from Claudette was a compliment. With the right vision for it, it could be truly extraordinary. It already is, I said pleasantly. It's home. She smiled in the way she always smiled at things I said, the smile reserved for harmless old women who could be endured rather than engaged, and moved past me into the house. The afternoon proceeded the way the best summer gatherings proceed. Food spread across tables in quantities that would have embarrassed any individual host but seemed entirely natural in the context of a family that had been cooking for each other for 30 years. Children running through the fields and the yard with the specific full-body joy of children released from ordinary constraints. Raymond playing guitar in the shade. Stories traded between old men who had known each other long enough to tell the same stories and still find them worth telling. I moved through it all doing what I had always done, making sure everyone had what they needed, refilling dishes, knowing which cousin needed the folding chair with the extra cushion, keeping the lemonade cold, being the person who held the gathering together by the 1,000 invisible actions that such gatherings require. This was my role and I performed it with the ease of long practice, and for a while the familiarity of it was almost enough to make the last 3 weeks feel distant. Almost. I noticed that Marcus and Claudette had settled at a table on the far side of the oak tree with Preston and Vivian Beaumont, who had driven up from Brentwood. I had not known Claudette was inviting her parents to the Hargrove family reunion. I noted it and kept moving. Around 3 in the afternoon, while I was in the kitchen refilling a biscuit platter, I heard through the open window the conversation that removed whatever remained of my doubt. Raymond's voice first, slow and careful. I just hope whatever happens to this land, it stays with the family. Ernest loved Pinecrest more than just about anything in the world. A brief silence. Then Marcus, smooth and assured, the voice he used when he was establishing authority in a room, of course it'll stay in the family, Uncle Raymond. I'm managing the estate and I have a plan in place that I think everyone's going to be really excited about. Dad had his way of doing things and we all respected that, but the market for land like this right now is extraordinary. I've been in serious conversations with some major development interests who see the potential here in ways that go well beyond what a working farm generates. We're talking premium residential, a development that would produce a return for this family that Dad simply couldn't have imagined. Raymond, uncertain now, what does Dorothy think about all this? A pause. Longer than it should have been. Mom's going to come around. She's been through a hard 2 years and change is difficult. But she'll see that this is the right decision for the family. I'm going to make sure she understands. Mom is going to come around. I set down the biscuit platter. Renee had come quietly into the kitchen behind me. She had heard it. Our eyes met. He's announcing it today, she said quietly. In front of everyone. I know, I said. The envelope? Right cardigan pocket. She nodded once, steadily. Wait for the moment, she said. I picked up the biscuit platter and carried it outside. The afternoon continued. More food. More music from Raymond. The children's game in the back field had evolved into something elaborate and entirely self-governing. The tables were scattered with the pleasant debris of a long and happy meal. I was carrying a stack of empty dessert plates toward the house, doing what needed doing, the way I had spent 50 years doing what needed doing, when it happened. The gravel path near the big oak has a slight rise where the roots have pushed up underneath and made the surface uneven. I have walked that path more times than I can count across more decades than I like to calculate. But I was carrying a full stack of plates and not watching my footing carefully enough, and my foot caught the raised stone. I lurched forward. Not a fall, I caught myself against the arm of a nearby lawn chair before it became anything more, but the top 2 plates slid off the stack and hit the gravel with a sharp crack that silenced the nearby conversations and turned 20 heads in my direction. I steadied myself. I was not hurt. I was mildly embarrassed. I straightened up and would have continued to the house without another word if my son had not spoken. Mother, honestly. His voice cut across the yard with the clean carrying quality of a man accustomed to being heard in rooms. Every conversation in range stopped. I turned and looked at him. His face was tight with an expression I recognized with a pain that went past hurt into something more fundamental. Not concern. Not the face of a son checking whether his mother was injured. Embarrassment. Pure and undisguised embarrassment, directed entirely at me, calibrated entirely by the audience around him, his in-laws, his business associates, the carefully curated image of a successful man who had risen above his origins. Would you let someone else handle that? You've been on your feet all day, Mom. You're going to hurt yourself. He made a gesture with one hand that was dismissive and condescending simultaneously, a gesture that placed me into a category, elderly mother, becoming a liability, needs managing. I'm perfectly fine, Marcus, I said calmly. I just dropped a couple of plates. I know, but... He paused. He looked around at the watching family. At his in-laws in their expensive summer clothes. At the 40-odd people who had come to this gathering because they had loved Ernest and loved me and had been part of this family for decades. And something crossed my son's face in that moment that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. A flash of irritation, naked and unmanaged, at the spectacle of his old mother stumbling on the gravel path at a gathering she had organized entirely by herself. You're embarrassing the family, Mother, he said. The yard went still. Raymond's guitar had stopped. Dale was looking at the ground with the focused attention of a man who has chosen not to witness something. Renee sat absolutely still at her table. The Beaumonts were watchful and careful. 47 people either hearing it or feeling the quality of the silence that followed it. I stood in the gravel path of the home Ernest had built and I felt the last door close. Not dramatically. Not with grief or rage. Quietly, the way well-fitted doors close, with a solid final click that you feel more than hear. I looked at my son. Then I looked at the right pocket of my cardigan. Then I looked at Renee, standing at her table with those steady eyes. Then I looked at Theo, who had come in from the back field at some point and was standing at the edge of the gathering in his grass-stained clothes with his grandfather's exact quality of stillness, watching everything carefully. I turned back to my son. You're right, I said quietly. There are some things that should probably be addressed. Right now. In front of everyone. I walked to the long folding table beneath the oak tree that Ernest had planted the year Marcus was born and I set down the one unbroken plate. Then I reached into the right pocket of my cardigan and removed the envelope that Arthur Pembroke had delivered to my door on Friday afternoon. Heavy cream paper. Every page notarized and witnessed and legally binding in every detail. I opened the envelope. I would like to read something, I said clearly. I'd like everyone here to hear this. The paper was crisp and official in my hands. My hands were steady. I had expected them to shake and they did not. Marcus had been watching me with an expression moving rapidly through confusion toward alarm. Mom. What is that? I looked at him briefly and then addressed the assembled family. This is the Hargrove Family Trust, I said. It was established by Ernest Lloyd Hargrove before his death in 2020. I am the sole trustee of all assets within it. I would like to read the relevant provisions so that everyone here fully understands the legal situation regarding Pinecrest Farm and the other assets that Ernest spent his life building. Mom. Marcus's voice had changed completely. The lawyer fully present, calculating, managing. This is not the time or the place for. This is his family, I said. And this is his land. I believe it is exactly the time and place. Did you know about this? Claudette said sharply to Marcus. I found the first page and I began to read. The Hargrove Family Trust was established on February 14, 2020, by Ernest Lloyd Hargrove of Cedarfield, Tennessee. The trust encompasses the following assets. First, Pinecrest Farm, 114 acres at 4402, Hargrove Ridge Road, Cedarfield, Tennessee, current assessed value approximately $3.2 million. The number settled over the yard with physical weight. Someone made a sound, low and involuntary. I heard Claudette say very quietly to Marcus, 3 point, and stop herself. Second, a 62% majority stake in Hargrove Parts LLC of Gallatin, Tennessee, current estimated value $840,000. Third, investment and savings accounts totaling approximately $460,000. I looked up. I could see the numbers working through the gathering. Raymond sitting with his guitar across his knees with the expression of a man rearranging something fundamental. Dale looking directly at Marcus now with a look that was quiet and grave. Renee with her hands folded on the table in front of her and tears on her face she was making no effort to conceal. Theo standing very still with his grandfather's eyes. I went back to the document. Dorothy Jean Hargrove is designated as sole trustee of all assets for the duration of her natural life. No sale, transfer, encumbrance, collateralization, or other disposition of any trust asset may be undertaken without the written authorization of the sole trustee. Any agreement, negotiation, verbal commitment, or representation made by any person other than the designated trustee regarding trust assets is without legal authority. I looked up. And void, I said. Any such agreement is legally void. Including any agreement made with Sycamore Ridge Development Group during months of meetings that my son held without my knowledge. Including the $400,000 line of credit taken out against this property by my son at a Nashville bank. Void. Without legal authority. Every word of it. The silence was absolute. You also told them, I said quietly, looking directly at my son, that I was in declining health and expected to be out of the picture within 1 to 2 years. You used my anticipated death as a projected date in a business negotiation. From somewhere in the gathering came the sound of a single very controlled exhale. Ernest's cousin Ruth Ann, who had known me since before Marcus was born. Theo stood at the edge of the yard in his grass-stained clothes and looked at his father with the expression of a child seeing something clearly for the first time that he cannot unsee. That was the moment that cut deepest. Not for my sake. For that boy. Marcus stood up from his chair. His face was ash-colored. I could see him calculating, processing, looking for the professional path through what was happening. Then something in him seemed to give. I was drowning, Mom. His voice cracked. The house, the school fees, everything we had built, I was completely underwater. I thought if I could just get the deal structured before. Marcus. Claudette's voice from her chair, sharp as a slap. He looked at her. Then back at me. I was going to bring you into it properly, he said. I had it all planned. Once the framework was. You used my land as collateral, I said. Land you do not own. That is not a framework. That is fraud. Preston Beaumont, who had been sitting very still throughout all of this with the expression of a man making calculations he does not want to make, spoke at last. Marcus, he said carefully. Is what she's saying accurate? Did you use property you have no title to as collateral for a bank loan? Marcus said nothing. Preston looked at his daughter. Claudette. Claudette's chin came up in that familiar gesture of defended pride. Daddy, it's more complicated than she's making it sound. It is not complicated, I said. And I said what I should have said years earlier. What Ernest might have wanted me to say before he left. My husband built this land over 50 years. He worked every day of his life. He went without things so that this family could have something real. He was never going to be wealthy in the way that some people are wealthy, he was never going to have what the Beaumont family has, but what he built was solid and it was honest and it was his in a way that very few people's possessions ever truly are. My voice remained level. I was not angry in the way that people who have lost control are angry. I was angry the way a fire is steady, contained, controlled, and entirely clear about what it is. And his son took what Ernest built and used it as a chip in a financial game played entirely for the purpose of maintaining an image. An image of success and wealth that my son could not honestly afford and that my son's wife required him to sustain at any cost. They did this while I sat in this house on this land and trusted my son the way you trust the people you have spent your whole life loving. They did this while telling strangers that their elderly mother was expected to die soon. I paused. I want everyone here to know the truth. Not because I enjoy this. Not because I want to humiliate my son in front of his family. But because Ernest spent 50 years building this and I will not allow that work to be disposed of in secret by people who were waiting for me to die. This land is mine. The trust is mine to steward. And that is going to remain true for as long as I am breathing. The yard was entirely still. Then Preston Beaumont stood up from his chair. He was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where power was exercised and he knew what it looked like from both sides. He looked at me for a long moment. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. I owe you an apology. Not for what my daughter and your son did, that is their accounting to make, but for years of watching my daughter treat you with a disrespect I should have addressed long before today and choosing not to. I'm addressing it now. I'm sorry. You don't owe me anything, I said. You didn't do this. No, he said simply. But I should have spoken sooner. Vivian Beaumont sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing at all and looked, for the first time since I had known her, genuinely small. Marcus put his hand over his face. He sat there for a moment with his hand over his face and 30-some adults watching in the July afternoon light. Then he looked up. His eyes were wet. Mom, he said. I'm sorry. You can be sorry, I said. That is a starting place. But sorry doesn't answer to your father's memory and it doesn't restore the trust that you broke. Those things take time and genuine work. More than today. I turned to the gathering. I'm sorry for the interruption, I said. There's still plenty of cobbler and I made Raymond's lemon pound cake. I think we should eat some more dessert. I picked up the envelope. I walked back to the house. Behind me the yard began to breathe again. Raymond's guitar picking up a single quiet chord. Someone producing a careful, uncertain laugh at something Ruth and said about the cobbler. The cautious resumption of life continuing. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and ran cold water over my wrists at the sink because my hands were shaking now that it was done, now that the resolve had released and left the ordinary woman standing in her ordinary kitchen in the ordinary afternoon light. The screen door opened. I expected Renee. It was Theo. He crossed the kitchen without saying anything and pressed himself against my side the way he had done since he was small, his head against my shoulder, his arms around my waist, saying nothing at all. I held on. Grandma, he said after a minute. Is Dad going to go to jail? I don't know yet, I told him honestly. There are people looking carefully at what happened. I can't tell you how it will end. He was quiet, absorbing this with a bravery he had not been asked to summon and was summoning anyway. I'm sorry, he said. For what they did. Baby, I said. That is not yours to apologize for. Not one bit of it. He pressed closer for a moment. Then he looked up at me. Can we still have the peach ice cream later? The laugh that came out of me was real and sudden and rose from somewhere deeper than the afternoon. Theo, I said. We absolutely can. He smiled, clear and uncomplicated, and went back outside. I want to tell you about what happened in the yard after I went inside, because Renee told me about it later in full detail and I think it belongs to this story. For about 2 full minutes after I walked back to the house, no one spoke. Raymond sat with his guitar balanced on his knees and looked at the ground. Dale sat with his hands flat on the table. The Beaumonts sat very still. The 30-odd adults in the yard who had witnessed everything sat in the particular silence of people processing something they will be thinking about for a long time afterward. Then Raymond cleared his throat and spoke quietly, to no one in particular. Ernest always said Dorothy was the strongest person he had ever known in his life, he said. I don't think I fully understood what he meant until today. That was all he said. He picked up his guitar and played a single slow chord. Someone at one of the back tables quietly began to cry. Someone else began talking about something unrelated in a low voice. And gradually, the way water closes over a stone dropped into it, the gathering reassembled itself around what had just happened. Marcus sat at his table for a long time without speaking to anyone. Claudette sat beside him and also said nothing and did not touch him. At some point Preston Beaumont walked over and sat down across from his son-in-law and spoke to him quietly and with visible seriousness for several minutes. Marcus listened and did not respond for a long while, and then said something quiet, and Preston nodded, and what was agreed between them in those minutes was the beginning of what would eventually resolve the legal situation, not cleanly or completely, but enough. Theo stayed at Pinecrest that night. We sat on the porch after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and the tables folded and put away, eating the last of the peach cobbler, listening to the night sounds, the cattle in the distance, the tree frogs in the cedars, the deep quiet of a summer night on land that has been loved for a long time. Grandpa would have been proud of you today, Theo said. I sat with that for a moment. I think your grandpa set things up the way he did so I would never need to be brave the way I was brave today, I said. He hoped the trust would protect this family without this conversation ever having to happen. I looked out at the dark fields. But when it came to it, yes. I think he would have been glad I read it. We sat in the dark on Ernest's porch for another hour, not saying much, just being present together on the land, and it was one of the most peaceful evenings I have known since he died. The months that followed were neither quick nor simple, but they moved with a certain inevitability. The bank's fraud investigation confirmed everything Arthur had established. Marcus had collateralized a property he had no legal title over, a federal offense. The case was referred to the district attorney within 2 weeks of the reunion. Marcus retained a white-collar defense attorney from a prominent Nashville firm, whose considerable fees were quietly paid by Preston Beaumont. Preston had decided, I understood and did not resent his decision, that allowing his son-in-law to face the full weight of criminal prosecution without assistance served no one's long-term interests. He helped. But he helped with strings attached that I would only learn about later. The resolution took several months to negotiate. Marcus pleaded guilty to a reduced charge. He paid substantial restitution to the bank. He surrendered his partnership status pending a bar association review. His law license was suspended for 18 months. He received a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. Sycamore Ridge Development Group, informed of the trust structure and having never formally recorded any agreement with Marcus, withdrew their interest without further legal action. Arthur made certain of that. The $400,000 credit line was voided by court order. Pinecrest was safe. The Brentwood house went on the market within 3 months. It sold at a loss. Marcus and Claudette moved to a smaller house in a Nashville suburb that bore no resemblance to the life they had been maintaining. Claudette took a position as an events coordinator at a downtown hotel, the first genuine employment of her adult life. Marcus, with his license suspended, did consulting work for a small Murfreesboro firm. He worked, by all accounts, without complaint and without the performance of someone who believed he was above what he was doing. Theo spent the summer at Pinecrest and we made peach ice cream from the old tree and repaired the north fence line and talked about everything freely. He asked careful questions about his father and I answered them the way Ernest had taught me to answer hard questions, completely, honestly, and with the understanding that people deserve the truth about the people they love. Is Dad a bad person? Theo asked one evening on the porch. Your dad made some very bad choices, I said. People who make bad choices aren't always bad people. But the work of becoming better belongs to them. Not to you. Not to me. I think he's trying, Theo said quietly. I hope so, I said. I genuinely do. Lily came for a weekend in August, just her, and was uncertain when she arrived in the careful way of teenagers who have built a distance and aren't sure whether to maintain it. By the last morning she was sitting beside me on the porch swing with her head on my shoulder saying she missed Grandpa. I held her and told her I missed him every single day. We sat in the August morning with the swing moving gently and the fields in the early light and neither of us said anything else and neither of us needed to. Marcus wrote me a letter in October. He called me Mama. He had not done that since he was 12 years old. The word nearly undid me before I read another line. He said he was ashamed not because he had been caught but because he had taken 50 years of his father's honest work and treated it like a number on a spreadsheet. He said he had looked at what Ernest and I had built over a lifetime and seen it only as a financial instrument to be converted into a number that would solve a problem of his own making. He said he had spent years running from where he came from because he had convinced himself that his origins reflected on his worth. That the modest house on the gravel road, the second-hand furniture, the mother in the Dillard's dress, these things said something about what he was, and he was desperate to say something different. He had pursued wealth and status and the appearance of a particular kind of success with the energy of a man fleeing something rather than building something, and Claudette had reinforced that flight because it served her own purposes, and he had let her because the truth was he had wanted exactly what she was offering. He said there was nothing in his entire professional career, none of the deals structured, none of the clients represented, none of the partnership titles or the office with a view of the Nashville skyline, that equaled what his father had accomplished with his hands and his patience and his honesty. He said he understood that now in a way he could not have understood it before, because understanding it required losing the thing he had been using to avoid understanding it. He said the hardest thing he had sat with was the moment at the reunion when he looked at Theo. At his 13-year-old son standing at the edge of the gathering in his grass-stained clothes, watching his father being exposed in front of the whole family, and holding himself together with a dignity that Marcus had not managed to maintain at twice that age. He said he had looked at Theo and understood for the first time, not intellectually but in his body, in whatever part of a person actually registers truth, what he had done. Not to a bank. Not to a development company. Not to a legal process. To his son. To the boy who had followed Ernest around Pinecrest Farm since he could walk and who loved his grandmother's peach ice cream and who had come in from the back field on that July afternoon and stood quietly and witnessed his father's worst moment with more grace than his father deserved. He said he was working. Every single day. Not performing remorse or managing the image of a man who had learned his lesson. Actually working, in therapy, at his consulting job, in his marriage, in his relationship with his children, on becoming the person he should always have been working on becoming instead of spending his energy becoming something that looked impressive from the outside. He said he was sorry. Truly. In his bones. I read the letter twice through without stopping. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with my coffee going cold and the morning light moving across the floor and I thought about Ernest. About what he would say if he could see all of this. He would say that Marcus had found the road again. But that the walking was still his son's work to do. He would say that I had done exactly what he trusted me to do. He would say that Pinecrest was still standing. And as long as it was standing, we had not failed. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the kitchen table where I keep the things that matter, my parents' wedding photograph, Ernest's last letter to me written from the hospital, a drawing Theo made at 7 of Pinecrest Farm seen from above with the word home printed in large careful letters at the bottom. Then I got up and went out to the porch. It has been 1 year since the reunion. I am still at Pinecrest. I will always be at Pinecrest. This land is mine in the way that only places can be yours when you have lived and loved and worked and grieved on them, not just legally, not just as a matter of documents and titles and trust provisions, but in the deep and cellular way of belonging. The pines on the North Ridge are part of my breathing. The peach tree behind the barn is part of my calendar. The sound of the cattle in the morning is part of what tells me I am still here and still myself. The land is better managed than it has been in years, under the care of an agricultural company I engaged through Arthur's guidance, professionals who understand Tennessee Hill country farming and who have brought an efficiency and knowledge to the back acres that even Ernest might have appreciated, though he would have needed convincing. The cattle herd is healthy and expanded. The hay production is stronger. The old fence line along the east pasture that had needed attention for 2 years has been properly repaired. Ernest would approve of all of it. He would walk the property in his quiet way, look at each thing carefully, say very little, and the absence of complaint would be the highest compliment he could offer. Hargrove Parts in Gallatin had a strong year. Their manufacturing contracts with regional automotive suppliers have expanded, and the management team, which had known about the majority trust ownership since Ernest's death, received me at my first board meeting in the autumn with a respect that was genuine and unperformed. I sat at that table and listened and asked questions and understood about a quarter of what was being discussed in technical detail, and at the end of the meeting the plant manager, a man named Vincent Okafor who had worked for the company for 18 years, walked me to my car and said that Ernest had been the best kind of business partner, patient, fair, and always more interested in whether the work was good than whether the numbers were impressive this quarter. I drove home and cried for half an hour in the driveway before I could go inside. Good tears. The kind that come from being seen accurately. Arthur Pembroke retired in the spring, as he had been planning to do for 2 years. He came to Pinecrest the week before he officially left the practice, and we sat on the porch and drank iced tea and talked about Ernest and about the reunion and about the 30 years of our professional relationship that had been one of the anchors of my adult life. When he stood up to leave he held my hand for a moment and said, "Ernest knew what he was doing when he put that trust in your name, Dorothy. He always knew exactly what he was doing." His replacement, Claire Sato, drives out from Nashville every few weeks and is becoming someone I trust with the same steadiness that trust was earned, slowly and through consistent demonstration. Renee and Paul have been out to Pinecrest 3 times since the reunion, and our conversations about the farm's future have taken on a quality that Ernest would have recognized and valued: honest, collaborative, patient, with a shared understanding of what the land means and what protecting it requires across generations. Whatever happens when my time comes, this land will be in hands that love it for what it is. Theo turned 14 in the fall and will be 15 in the spring and has already sent me a text asking whether he can come for the whole summer. I answered yes before I finished reading the message. He is growing into someone remarkable, that boy. He has his grandfather's quality of stillness and his grandmother's willingness to work without making a production of it, and he has something that belongs entirely to himself, a kind of clear moral sight that was visible in him even at 5 years old and is sharpening as he grows. He is going to be more than all right. Lily came twice after the August visit. Once in October and once at Christmas. The second visit she spent 2 full days helping me sort through some of Ernest's papers and belongings that I had not been able to face alone, and she did it with a gentleness and a patience that surprised me and did not surprise me. She is still figuring out who she is, the way 16-year-olds are supposed to be figuring it out. But she is figuring it out honestly now, without the false scaffolding of an address and an image that had been built for her by other people's choices. That is hard work and she is doing it. I am proud of her in a way I have not always been able to show her. Marcus and I have spoken several times this year. The conversations are still careful, still finding their ground, but they are getting longer and less managed. He called on Ernest's birthday in May and we talked for nearly an hour. He told me about his consulting work and I told him about the board meeting in Gallatin and he laughed, a real laugh, not the social performance laugh he had developed over the years of being a successful Nashville attorney, when I described my confusion during the technical sections of the manufacturing report. It was the first time I had heard my son laugh like himself in a very long time. At the end of that call he said, "Thank you for answering, Mama." And I said, "I will always answer." I meant both halves of that with complete honesty. I will always answer. Not because what he did was all right. It was not all right. Not because the wound has closed. It has not. But because I am his mother and he is trying, and because Ernest raised me to believe that love was something you showed through showing up, and I intend to show up for whatever this relationship becomes next, with clear eyes and open hands and the understanding that rebuilding takes longer than breaking and requires more patience than any single act of courage. We are not repaired. Perhaps we will never be entirely repaired in the way we were before. But we are moving, slowly, in the direction of something real. That is enough for now. That is more than I expected to have. What I know now, sitting in the porch swing on a quiet October morning with one full year between me and that July afternoon, is this. Ernest knew exactly what he was doing. He put that trust in my name because he knew me. 48 years of a shared life had given him a knowledge of who I was that was as precise and solid as the joints in the porch he built, fitted tight, no gap between. He knew that I would protect what he had built. He knew that I would not be moved by pressure or embarrassment or the desire to keep the peace at any cost. He knew that when the moment came, I would reach into my pocket and produce the truth. He knew all of this long before I knew it about myself. On the day of the reunion, my son stood in the yard of the home Ernest built and told me I was embarrassing the family. He said this while I was carrying plates from tables at a gathering I had organized and cooked and prepared and hosted alone. He said this in front of the family that home had held for 50 years. He was embarrassed by the visible evidence of what I was, a woman who worked, who served, who carried things and did what needed doing without announcement or complaint, because that image did not fit the story he had constructed about himself and the distance he had put between where he came from and where he had arrived. He had forgotten what the distance was made of. He had forgotten that the road he had traveled from Cedarfield to Nashville had been built by two people who went without things so he could have them. He had forgotten that the impressive man he had become had been made possible by a woman in a modest house on a gravel road who kept accounts at a kitchen table at midnight and by a man who sold 20 of his own hard-won acres without a word of complaint because their son needed to stay in school. He had forgotten what I was carrying. It was not plates. It was 50 years of Ernest's patience and my own. It was every decision made carefully and every sacrifice made without announcement. It was the second mortgage and the sold acres and the evenings I spent making numbers work so that my son would not have to. It was the trust that Ernest placed in my hands because after a lifetime of watching me he knew without question that I would hold it. And when my son told me I was an embarrassment, I reached into my pocket and I showed him what that holding was worth. Not in dollars. Not in acres. Not in any figure on Arthur Pembroke's notarized pages. In truth. In the plain and unadorned truth of what this family had built and how it had been built and who had stood beside it all the years it was being built. I am Dorothy Jean Hargrove. I am 72 years old and I have lived my entire life in Cedarfield, Tennessee. I raised my children in this house on this land. I worked and saved and loved without condition and kept the honest history of this family in my hands the way Ernest trusted me to keep it, and when the time came I held it up where everyone could see it. I am the trustee of everything this family built. On a hot July afternoon at a family reunion under the oak tree Ernest planted the year his son was born, when that son looked at me in front of 47 people and told me I was embarrassing the family, I reached into my cardigan pocket and I read the truth aloud. That is the most powerful thing I have ever done. That is the most important thing I have ever done. And I would do it again without hesitation. To everyone watching this story, especially those of you who have been made to feel that your age or your modest life or your willingness to work and give and serve quietly makes you somehow less than the people who have benefited from all of that giving, I want you to hear this clearly. Your history is not your embarrassment. Your work is not your shame. The life you built with honest hands is not a lesser thing because it lacks a certain address or a certain kind of polish or a certain kind of audience. Ernest Hargrove built 114 acres from 22. He built a manufacturing company from a part interest purchased for almost nothing. He did it quietly, steadily, without announcement or performance, across 50 years, because he believed the work was worth doing and because he understood that what you build honestly is the only thing that truly belongs to you, the only thing that cannot be taken, the only thing whose value is not subject to anyone else's appraisal. And when the time came for that work to speak for itself, it did. It spoke clearly. It spoke with authority. It spoke in a yard full of people who had known Ernest for 30 years and who understood immediately what they were hearing. It spoke very, very loudly. I hope that when your moment comes, when the moment arrives that asks you to reach into your pocket and produce the truth you have been quietly carrying, you find that you have been holding it all along. I hope you find that the years of working and giving and doing without and showing up have not diminished you. I hope you find that they have made you into someone with something real to say, and the authority to say it. Because dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you hold on to when they try to take it from you. It is something you carry in your cardigan pocket on a hot July afternoon in Tennessee. And when the time finally comes, you stand up straight and you read it aloud in front of everyone. My name is Dorothy Jean Hargrove. This is my porch. Ernest built it with his own hands from cedar he milled himself from trees on the north ridge of our land. This is my farm. We built it together across 50 years from 22 acres and a gravel road and 2 people who believed that what you build honestly is the only thing that truly belongs to you. This is my life. Every ordinary, hard-working, unglamorous, and genuinely mine inch of it. And I would not trade a single one of those inches for anything that anyone in an expensive house with an expensive car and a certain address in a certain neighborhood could offer me in exchange. And nobody, not my son, not his wife, not a development company in Nashville, not anyone with the wrong assumptions about what elderly women in cardigan sweaters are carrying in their pockets, is taking any of it from me. Not today. Not ever.